computer. Right. So, the object of this talk is I had published an article in English in the book organized by Lagarde and Tanqueiro. And I wanted to make my ideas available to Brazilian readers in the book I published last year in Portuguese by UERJ University Press. So the subject of my talk today is the process of self-translation of this article. As I had been studying the subject for some time, and I have always been dealing with the literary text, I had been thinking of the idea of changing the focus from the literary text. I had been thinking of the idea of, from literary text to academic self-translation. That is, I wanted to focus on researchers who write and translate their own text to disseminate the results of their work among their peers who belong to foreign audiences, seeking maybe prestige in international academy and national academy as well, or seeking future positions or scholarships in foreign universities. Please note that I'm thinking of the contemporary world or the academy world. Also, it seemed curious to me that dealing with the subject for so long, I had never translated a text of my own. And in this way, I had never experienced self-translation myself. So when I started organizing this volume, I selected a text already published in English and decided to face the task. I started translating it into Portuguese. That would be one of the novelties in this volume, the translation of the text previously published in English by the author herself, in this case, me. Another novelty seemed to me more frightening at that moment. I decided to write an autoethnographic account of self-translation and invite listeners, in this case, the listeners, you, to relive my experience of self-translation and try to make my personal experience meaningful. And then I saw myself trying to start writing the account. To compose this autoethnographic account, I need to produce an artifact. I chose to write a kind of diary, a self-translation diary, so to speak. As I self-translated, I took notes of the process, as you can see. At first, my notes were long, and I stopped many times in the first stages of the process to write down ideas I thought relevant. I noticed there was a sort of filter. Everything I had read and discussed about literary translation, mainly, except for Verena Young's English-German self-translation of academic texts, as you will see. But the stops and notes became less frequent and shorter. As I analyze them now, I think they got shorter because the topics, the decisions I made at the beginning of the translation, and the difficulties I faced kept repeating themselves. Also, the most complex searches were made right at the beginning of the translation process. Therefore, the notes seemed unnecessary, at least to me. Let's see some examples of the difficulties faced and choices made along the process of self-translation. I organized the notes into sections. The first section is what I called culturally conditioned changes. On various occasions, I used the adjective Brazilian in the English text in reference to João Baldo Ribeiro. It is obvious that if the article is written in English and the foreign audience is the target, it is necessary to describe João Baldo, an author who is not popular among the few English readers of Brazilian literature. Many times in the English text, I repeated the adjective Brazilian in order to emphasize his nationality, since hardly any foreign reader had heard of him. Now, for the Brazilian audience, I don't need to keep saying that João Baldo Ribeiro is Brazilian. As Verena Young stated back in 1999, many of the changes a self-translator introduces into the text are culturally conditioned. Also, I believe it's needless to say, but culture is in texts, and texts are cultural artifacts, be they literary or academic. Now, verb forms. There are questions about verb forms. Time has passed, and two self-translators I mentioned in the text have died. I had heard recently about André Brink's death. The author died during a trip back to Cape Town, a plane trip back to Cape Town. And João Baldo Ribeiro also died. I woke up one day in July, and when I opened my email box, I read a message. Alice, João Baldo died. I thought of you. I became a kind of widow. The truth is that I had to think about the text. Changes in verb forms, for example, were necessary because of the deaths. A mix of language and culturally conditioned changes. Then, useful tools, another section. Word reference, Lingui, Google Translator. I hadn't heard of DeepL at the time. Sketch Engine. I love Sketch Engine for collocations. I'm mad about collocations, crazy for collocations. So there are a few references in the literature on self-translation to the translation process that the author translator goes through. This seems obvious since it's not easy to observe the process of self-translation. Moreover, self-translation usually becomes an object of interest after it takes place. In the case of my study of João Baldo Ribeiro's self-translations, I only started to study them about 3 years after the author translated his novels. In other words, very few researchers observed the process of self-translation. In fact, I remember Lilian Filgueiras, a researcher at the Federal University of Espírito Santo. She's the only self-translation scholar I know who had the chance to witness the process of self-translation of a novel, but she did not explore this aspect in her PhD dissertation. So what do we have besides that? Recently, some very interesting product-based translation studies, when the process is recovered by means of the analysis of the product. Also, we have what the authors are willing to reveal. And what do they reveal? André Brink talked about his process of self-translation in an interview that is available in YouTube. Others wrote memoirs and autobiographies and give brief accounts. But few author translators talk about the minor between quotation marks, practical aspects, so to speak, of the task of self-translating a text. João Baldo Ribeiro wrote an article whose title is Suffering in Translation. In it, he writes about the practical difficulties in the best of his amusing personal style. I'd say that self-translators' styles vary, but the purpose, as I see it, is one: to play the role of ambassadors, agents, or career brokers, as Reinier Grootman has already talked about. Well, but I imagine that the process of academic self-translation might be a little easier to observe if one is willing to observe it. Then another topic, freedom. As I translated the article, a few sentences came to mind and I barely looked at the original as I translated. It seems true that when the author is also the translator, he's allowed to do whatever he wants. I remember a professional translator, Regina Lira, who said, and I quote, "He's the author of the text. He does whatever he wants," in reference to João Baldo Ribeiro and his translation of Sargento Getúlio. Regina Lira was very critical of João Baldo's solutions that I presented as examples. Then she suddenly remembered that he was also the author of the original text, and she said the sentence. And I remembered João Baldo saying that he did not agree. He said he tried not to, and I quote, "not to touch up anything, not to rewrite anything, that what is written is written." And I related João Baldo's attitude to a kind of respect for the readers. But there are mandatory changes. To translate is to transform. It's not possible to translate a text and at the same time believe that you will be able to present the foreign reader with the same text that the writer produced when writing the originals, with the same meanings. This would lead us into believing, as some still do, and João Baldo did, that translation is impossible. But there are also changes that might be called betrayals to the original. And it is these betrayals that the author-translator is allowed to commit and that the translator cannot, as some do believe, still believe. When the author commits them, they cease to be betrayals, they are changes. When I translate my own text, I do introduce changes, except that my text is not literary and the charges, therefore, are different and they are mine. The literature on self-translation has progressed, and what I wrote about self-translation a few years ago are different today. Revision, adjustments, changes are unavoidable. But one of these changes does not have to do with developments in the literature. I replacement, declaração, statement with weapon, arma, in the translation. Since I thought now, as I translated the text into Portuguese, I needed a stronger word. The sense of weapon for Ngudi, the Kenyan author, has always been present. I believe self-translation has been a weapon for him. So I replaced statement with weapon and I was happier with the result. Another alteration, to avoid repetition, I changed the meaning and I modalize a lot, using language tentatively on some occasions, while on others I become very straightforward, less tentative, and introduce always before affects the target literary system. Again, the fact that I am the author makes me more comfortable to introduce the choices I want without considering too much what I meant in the original that I had published 2 years before. Anyway, I am happier with the result of the translation. It is a fact that self-translation, as well as any translation, always affects the target literary system in one way or another. Again, I decided to make other adjustments and introduced very significant changes into the paragraph on editors. I ended up saying that not many comments have been published to date on the relationship between these writers, self-translators, and their editors, and the number of changes suggested by them. In other words, it is possible that there is not so much control or so much autonomy. After all, editors usually suggest changes in the final product. It is quite different from the original. Again, the fact that I am the author of the original does give me freedom to decide. improving the text with inclusions or omissions usually means that the author-translator is also the editor of his own work and is therefore free to decide, as Verena Young says about the academic authors translators, Hannah Arendt specifically. However, again, I insist not so much has been said about the relationship between literary self-translator and their editors. Then another topic is the original limit. On the other hand, I do return to the original text, trying to translate it as closely and literally as possible. After all, that's what I had promised myself to do, the translation of an article. I had written and published in English, but the original is not a straitjacket. As I review my comments, I see topics that are related to the work of any translator. After all, any translator, professional or not, beginner or not, author or not of his or her own text or not, makes choices as the translation progresses. Their choices may or may not be correct, but they are unavoidable because they are part of the translator's work. Then I, too, the translator of my own original in English, chose vocabulary, grammar forms, tools to get to the text in Portuguese. Besides, any translator, self-translator or not, has his or her favorite tools and chooses to work with those he or she considers more adequate to the task he or she needs to perform. That's what I did. But as I translate, I usually play with the choices and tools I have at my disposal. And I go back and forth, try out new ones all the time. Choices are made, but self-translators' choices might be different from translators' choices. And I also have the notes on the process of self-translation. I like to make notes. I have a number of notebooks with all sorts of notes about different things, articles I read, articles I write, classes I give. Going back to the notes on my self-translated article, it is true that the author can change his or her text if he or she wishes. After all, the rights to the text he or she produces are his or her own. It seems to me now, reviewing my original text and translating it myself, that the changes are sometimes due to developments in theorizing about self-translation. Since my PhD dissertation in 2007, the discussion on self-translation has moved on and many papers have been published. When I become more assertive in commenting on the relationship between authors and publishers, for example, I'm actually showing, in my opinion, this is a discussion that has to move on, as in the Kundera case. And I myself take the opportunity to launch some ideas on the subject based on the case of João Baldo Ribeiro and some of his editors as a starting point. And as I see my notes, I believe that the major differences between the original and the self-translated text have to do with content. Thinking back of Verena Young's findings, I do agree with her when she says that self-translators restructure their academic self-translators restructure their academic text as they work. And it seems to me that when you change the content, along with it, the text is necessarily restructured. However, I'm not sure, but I think I'm influenced by the romantic idea of the original and the studies on self-translation. And I felt kind of submissive to the authority of the firstly published text. Also, because the one in English had been published before, I felt kind of submissive to the first readers who had read those ideas, although the text had been written in English. Who reads a text written by a Brazilian writer in English? I doubt, I wonder. What I'm saying is that in spite of the fact that I made changes, I felt I was kind of betraying those readers. Who am I as a researcher? What kind of researcher am I, in fact? The identity of the researcher was being challenged all the time as I self-translated and changed what I had written first. Well, finally, these reflections have led me into general questions. What takes place during the process of self-translating a text that can be said to be different from the process of translating it? This seems to be an eternal question. How do literary and academic self-translation relate? How do literary and academic self-translation studies relate? What is there in common between these studies? Are research questions interchangeable? Are there studies on academic self-translation? Is this a term, academic self-translation? To what extent is the process of self-translation an experiment for other processes such as the writing process or the translation teaching process? That is, by self-translating, can I learn to write? By self-translating, can I learn how to teach translation? How similar are the roles of the literary and of the academic self-translator? Can the academic self-translator be said to be an ambassador, an agent, or even a career broker? Translation always affects the target literary system in one way or another, I said. How do academic self-translations affect the target academic system? And these questions have led me into the start of a new project about the history of academic self-translation, if this is a term. And this is a project on the history of academic self-translation into and out of Portuguese through the centuries. I want to see the role of the Portuguese language, the role it's played in this exchange, because there has been an exchange. And who were the self-translators who have been the self-translators through the centuries? I've already begun to work on it, and I hope to have news in the near future. I hope I have not talked more than the 20 minutes, but that's it. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll stop sharing. Thank you. I'll stop sharing and stop recording.